Here in 2022, Top Gun Maverick has taken the box office by storm. But what can you learn as a screenwriter from this sequel to the 1986 original Top Gun? How's it? Chop screenplay prep. Now, this is a discussion about a sequel, but this isn't about screenwriting sequels. The reason being that if you've written a successful first, it's possible that you wouldn't need to come to me for information as to how to best write a sequel. However, you could be in a situation where you're writing two movies back to back, the second screenplay being the sequel to the first, so there could be something in it. However, this is really about what makes Top Gun Maverick particularly successful. Yes, it does ride off the back of the original 1986 film, but 36 years later, this is written by a different group of screenwriters and is a marked difference to the original. I don't believe that Top Gun Maverick particularly rides off the back of the first as far as new audiences are concerned. Certainly watching this sequel, for me, there's a degree of nostalgia, and it's great to see great characters back on screen. However, I do believe it provides ample material for new viewers who may not have been around to see the first in its time. Therefore, the second doesn't necessarily need the original Top Gun for those viewers. That in itself is excellent writing. It's not like a TV show where you might need to have seen season 1 before you see season 2. The formula is pretty similar. Now, I don't want to get into a review of Top Gun Maverick, but the plot line is similar in that there is a training exercise that then leads into real battle, and we've got the marriage of egos and desire to win and be on top that gets in the way of the characters proceeding. I believe what they got right with the second one, and which is then reflected in the critical acclaim for the second, is not pandering to the love story. The first got a little bit of criticism for messing with the whole action sequences by bringing in the Charlie and Maverick love scenes and romance and giving the film two storylines that didn't perhaps best go together. One trod on the toes of the other, you could say. When it comes to Top Gun Maverick, of course, it needs to pander to a love interest, but I believe with the Jennifer Connelly character, they got it right in not allowing it to go too far and tread upon the toes of the action sequences. It's very much the Top Gun theme. It's fast planes in the sky. It's very much about adrenaline, and you've almost bought the ticket to see exactly that. So from a writing perspective, I think they handled that very well. Therefore, as a screenwriter, if you have a story which might be more action heavy and certainly military, espionage or otherwise, you might just want to check the balance of how perhaps your romantic interest goes, as far as outweighing the reason potentially the film exists in the first place and why people might be coming to see it. A lot of things when you're looking at your story or plot line do come down to balance, and you need to be certain of your overall theme. So if the film is about revenge, then ensure that romance doesn't overpower the whole theme of revenge. Top Gun Maverick does a very good job in bringing in the backstory of, which is essentially in the first movie, Goose's death and Goose's son, Rooster, coming into the Top Gun Academy to be trained ultimately by Maverick, who in some ways people point the finger at as far as Goose's death. So it brings an excellent tension between these characters and creates an interesting backdrop for how they're going to train for this impossible mission and whether that's going to work out or not. So the love scenes with Jennifer Connelly's character, Penny, are not overpowering and nicely done. You could then ask or discuss as to their relevance and do they need to be there at all. One thing in screenwriting that is good to tackle and understand is if you picture a movie, particularly an action movie or a thriller, you're going to have this kind of sine wave of ups and downs. And that's important because if everything's this high level flat line of high intensity action, the audience never lets up. You've got to bring them down, let them rest, such that when you hit them again with your dramatic scene, your big bit of action, that you can raise their heart rate again. So it's not necessarily that you're being nice to them and you don't want to give them heart attacks. It's more about pulling back a little such that you can then proceed forwards again. So in the same way, a romantic interest can distract from the main event. So, for example, Titanic, criticized in many ways for perhaps spending too much time on the romantic scenes between Leonardo DiCaprio's character and Kate Winslet's. Sure, the film was a remarkable success, but perhaps from a writing perspective, if they toned down on that, it might have been a better balance. So in the same way, I think Maverick got the right balance between Penny and Maverick and ensured that we engaged fully with the action scenes, whether it was a training or then the ensuing mission to take out the uranium enrichment facility. Another aspect of Top Gun Maverick that works really well, I believe, is the element of nostalgia. Now, it, to a point, does harp back to a prequel, that Top Gun originally happened. So this isn't so much about you needing to write a sequel to be able to do this, but right now there's a big fad with the 80s. Now, in 5-10 years' time, if you're watching this video, it could be that fad is then the 90s. But right now, Stranger Things, a great Netflix TV show, really brings back the 1980s. And that's through memorabilia, it's what's in the background, it's the game of Dungeons and Dragons that the kids are playing, it's the toys that were around in the 80s, and these all feature as part of the story and as backdrops in the set. Now, in the same way with Top Gun Maverick, there's a nostalgic scene where we see Maverick in his living quarters, which looks to be some disused aviation hangar, old vehicles, bicycles, and photographs that throw back to the 1980s. Nostalgia, I believe, is something that's quite a powerful aspect to writing and filmmaking. So looking at Maverick and how there are these throwbacks to the past, that can really strengthen the story or involvement of your audience, particularly if you're embracing an older audience that would have been around in those times that you're throwing your writing back to. Whether you're setting your story in a bygone era or whether it's relevant to the story that you are in the 1970s and therefore showing 70s memorabilia, it's not something you should overdo because it comes down to set dressing. Ultimately, if your story is set in a particular era, that's down to the director and the production team to dress that. But it is worth peppering your script within the action description with items that might be highlights or key props, let's say, for that era in creating that feel, if it is important to the story, if it is relevant that you are trying to emphasize to the viewer that, yes, we're back in the 80s or we're back in the 70s. Top Gun Maverick is not set back in the 80s, it's present day. However, just those throwbacks of nostalgia just create an extra level or layer of interest for the audience. One of the other aspects of Top Gun Maverick that I believe really lends itself to success is the dialogue. It's the use of one-liners that, first of all, really befit the character. And I think Tom Cruise, as an actor, really fits this role perfectly as Maverick in playing this almost rebellious naval pilot who pushes things to the limits, has this cocky attitude, which comes through in his dialogue, and it's brilliant. It's when you sit in the cinema and you hear some of these lines, the reaction in the audience is just fantastic. Therefore, looking at the story that you might be writing, really get a sense of who your characters are, and can you take dialogue to these levels where, so for example, the Rear Admiral tells Maverick, "The end is inevitable, Maverick. Your kind is headed for extinction." To which Maverick responds, "Maybe so, sir, but not today." It's a very satisfying line. It's very simple, and yet it's very, very much something that the audience kind of, yeah, tell them, you tell them. It's one of those bits of dialogue that creates a level of satisfaction because you're putting you've led up to that situation in such a way that the audience relate to it and wish they could say that to their boss, for example. It's one of those lines that may be very silly and simple, but it's effective because I would love to say that if I were in his shoes. There is an excellent scene after Maverick crashes the test plane, having reached Mach 10. What we see is Tom Cruise's character walking into a diner that looks very much like he stepped back into the 1950s. The scene is very well shot, but just from a writing perspective, it's kept very simple. There's no dialogue really of what's going on within the diner between the customers or the lady serving behind the counter. After Maverick walks in, gestures at the water, drinks the water, this little kid is just sitting there and looks up at him, and Maverick looks down and asks, "Where am I?" And the kid just slowly replies, "Earth." It's absolutely fantastic. Again, very, very simple, but very well thought out. Very effective indeed. A great example of simple dialogue again, but it raises a degree of tension. Rooster's character says something like, "Don't tell me that we lost an engine," to which his co-pilot says, "Okay, I won't tell you that." These kind of lines of dialogue just require a bit of thinking. You know, you have your action scene, you have a sense of where you need to take your story, but every now and then just think about what could my characters say to each other, particularly when you've got a buddy, like a typical buddy cop situation, or like in this situation you've got a pilot and a co-pilot. You've got these two characters working together. What could they say, one say to the other, that just lightens the mood, particularly when they're in a dire situation? So just think with these clever lines of dialogue that you can really use them to lighten the mood in a tense situation by having one character say something to the other that just makes us laugh and essentially provides contrast to the situation at hand. When you get back to what's really happening, you know, you're switching the emotions again. As a writer, to either these things just come to you, or to inject these lines of dialogue with something funny or clever, you just simply need to sit back and just have a think and just relax. Don't force it, but just think about your characters as if they really exist. Put yourself in one of their shoes, think through the situation. What could be said that would tie into the story and bring it around in an amusing way? This isn't about being a comedian or turning your story into a comedy if it isn't already a comedy, but it's just simply about adding touches and flavor to your writing, and something that just allows to kind of help emphasize those peaks and troughs when you're going through tense scenes in a drama or action scenes, and just allowing the audience to come down to earth a bit, have a chuckle, and then blam, you can hit them again with your energy of whatever was going on in your story. And just a tip as to how to be thinking like this: watching a movie a second time within a week to 10 days is a great way to revisit the movie but see things at a different level. Your brain already understands what's happening next, and you're not necessarily watching the movie the second time to enjoy it again the second time, although you may well do. It's more about what can you pick up on that second viewing that you might not have noticed before. And I do rate seeing something in the cinema over your front room, simply because you've got an audience around you. Now, of course, if you go into that 10 a.m. showing in a tiny cinema in a small town, you might be the only person there. That in itself is quite a great experience. However, if you are trying to analyze story, it's very useful to get a sense of, well, what's working in the story that affects the audience. It might be that you don't particularly react to certain things, but a general audience does. And what was that? So if you're sitting there in a second viewing and everyone chuckles or gasps, pinpoint why that was, what led up to that, and use that knowledge to work out how you can do the same with your screenwriting. Well, I hope you found that interesting. That wasn't meant to be a review of Top Gun Maverick by any means, but more about just looking at a successful film and how you can use that to your advantage in your screenwriting. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.